The thing about advanced interspecies military academies is that they operate under the charming assumption that violence can be standardized, packaged, and delivered with the same efficiency as a cafeteria meal. Kepler Station Combat Academy had perfected this delusion over 2 centuries, turning warfare into something resembling an elaborate dance recital, complete with scoring rubrics and safety protocols that would make a kindergarten teacher proud. Weapons Master Kelthane adjusted his ceremonial crest feathers as he watched the human cadet stretch in the center ring. The Zephyrian had overseen approximately 4,000 combat assessments during his tenure, and he could predict outcomes with the same confidence other species reserved for planetary orbital mechanics. Humans, in his extensive experience, fell into a depressingly narrow range, enthusiastic but sloppy, aggressive but unfocused, and inevitably disappointed when their Hollywood-inspired fantasies met actual military doctrine. Designation Viper 7, Kelthane announced, his voice carrying particular condescension, reserved for species who still use projectile weapons in an age of plasma dynamics. Today's assessment involves standard melee protocols using regulation training blades. Victory conditions include 3 successful strikes to designated target zones, disarmament of opponent, or voluntary submission. Simulation parameters are now active. The human, a compact female with scars that suggested she'd already failed several practical assessments, caught the practice blade with one hand and examined it with the sort of casual interest most cadets reserve for their morning protein rations. The weapon was a masterpiece of safety engineering. Dulled edges, weighted balance, and embedded sensors that would register contact without actually causing damage. Perfect for civilized beings who understood that training was merely preparation for eventual theoretical violence. Questions before we begin? Kelthane inquired, already reaching for his own practice weapon. Viper 7 tested the blade's weight with a few experimental swings. This supposed to cut anything, or are we playing tag with expensive cutlery? Several observers in the gallery, junior instructors and advanced cadets from various systems, chuckled at what they assumed was typical human bravado. Kelthane's feathers fluffed slightly, a sign of mild irritation that his species couldn't quite suppress. The simulation environment provides accurate feedback without unnecessary injury, he explained, activating his own weapon. Combat assessment requires demonstrating technique, not causing actual harm. Right. Viper 7 said, and something in her tone made the hegemony communications specialist in the front row stop, taking notes. Technique. What happened next would require several incident reports, 2 emergency medical transports, and a complete revision of Academy's safety protocols. Kelthane opened with a classic Zephyrian thrust pattern designed to test defensive reflexes, a move that had been successfully parried by 97% of previous candidates. Viper 7 didn't parry. Instead, she stepped inside his reach, grabbed his weapon arm with her free hand, and used the momentum to drive her dulled training blade directly into the joint where his shoulder met his torso. The impact should have registered as a clean hit on the simulation sensors. Instead, it produced a sound remarkably similar to cartilage separating from bone. Kelthane's screech of pain was authentic enough to activate the arena's emergency medical protocols. But Viper 7 was already moving. She wrenched the practice weapon from a suddenly nerveless grip and spun to face the backup instructor, a Venturian who'd been approaching to call a halt to the assessment. "We stopping already?" she asked, holding both weapons now. Thought this was supposed to test combat readiness. The Venturian instructor, whose name was something unpronounceable involving clicking sounds, made a mistake of attempting to de-escalate with standard Academy rhetoric. "Cadet, the simulation parameters have clearly malfunctioned. Please return the weapons and report to medical evaluation." Viper 7 looked down at the practice blade in her right hand. A thin line of blue-green fluid, Zephyrian blood, traced along the theoretically harmless edge. She held it up for the gallery to see. "Simulation, huh?" she said. "Funny thing about simulations, they don't usually bleed." What followed was less a combat assessment and more an educational demonstration on the fundamental differences between species who had evolved past warfare and species who had simply gotten better at it. The Venturian lasted approximately 30 seconds before discovering that humans possessed an alarming ability to turn any object into an improvised weapon, including the arena's safety railings, which Viper 7 used to vault over his defensive position and land behind him with both training blades positioned against vulnerable nerve clusters. The medical team that eventually retrieved both instructors found Kelthane conscious, but immobilized, with his shoulder joint dislocated in 3 separate directions. The Venturian was unconscious but breathing, sporting what the medics politely termed extensive bruising consistent with blunt force trauma. Both weapons were returned to the equipment locker, though someone would later note that their molecular structure had been subtly altered, as if the metal itself had been convinced to remember what it felt like to be sharp. Viper 7 sat on the arena floor, methodically cleaning blood from her knuckles with a Regulation Academy towel, when the chief medical officer, a sensible Altarian who had seen enough combat injuries to recognize intentional damage, approached her. She looked up with an expression of genuine confusion. "So," she said, "do I pass, or was that just a warm-up?" The Altarian medic stared at her for a moment, then at the 2 instructors being loaded onto emergency gurneys, then back at the human who seemed completely oblivious to the fact that she had just redefined everyone's understanding of what constituted training. "What?" the medic asked carefully. "Did you think this assessment was supposed to measure?" Viper 7 shrugged. "Combat effectiveness. You know, whether I can handle myself in a real fight." She gestured toward the departing medical team. "Though if these guys are supposed to be instructors, you might want to reconsider your hiring standards." The gallery had fallen silent. 43 beings from 17 different systems watched as the human stood up, stretched again, and began walking toward the exit with the same casual attitude she might display after completing a particularly boring lecture on supply chain logistics. "Hey," she called back to the medic, "when's the next assessment? Because if this was the advanced version, I'm kind of curious what you call basic training." News traveled through Kepler Station with the efficiency of a quantum entanglement experiment. Instantaneous, inexplicable, and leaving everyone involved slightly more confused than before. Within 6 hours of the assessment incident, as the administration had diplomatically labeled it, the Academy's faculty lounge had transformed into something resembling a philosophical battlefield, complete with competing theories and wounded academic pride. Professor Zarek, 9, the station's leading xenoanthropologist, paced behind a holographic display showing primitive human weaponry, swords, axes, and other implements that civilized species had abandoned before achieving interstellar flight. His 6 arms gestured in complex patterns while his students took frantic notes. "Consider the archaeological evidence," he announced, manipulating the display to show ancient human battlefield sites. These beings spent millennia perfecting methods of ending each other with handheld implements, not studying warfare, practicing it daily for entertainment. Dr. Thesha Moonweaver, whose crystalline form refracted the room's lighting into prismatic patterns, chimed her disagreement. "You're anthropomorphizing destruction, Zarek. Every species develops conflict resolution mechanisms. The humans simply retain theirs longer due to environmental pressures." "Environmental pressures?" Commander Vex, a battle-scarred Karathi military advisor, leaned forward with the sort of interest that suggested he'd been waiting for this conversation his entire career. "I've reviewed their planetary history. These creatures weaponized everything: rocks, sticks, agricultural implements, even the weather. They turned food preparation into combat training." The debate might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Dr. Elena Vasquez, the station's only human faculty member, carrying a data pad and wearing the expression of someone who had just discovered her entire species, was the subject of an impromptu academic dissection. Fascinating theories, she said, settling into a chair designed for beings roughly half her size. Though you might want to check your data sources before declaring us all latent psychopaths. Zarek 9's display shifted to show human recreational activities, boxing matches, martial arts demonstrations, competitive contact sports. Explain this, then. Why do your people voluntarily engage in ritualized violence for amusement? Elena studied the images with the same clinical detachment her colleagues usually reserve for extinct civilizations. Same reasons Ephirians perform aerial combat dances during mating season, I suppose. Cultural expression through physical prowess. Those are ceremonial displays, Dr. Moonweaver protested. Highly stylized, non-lethal. Perform under strict social contracts. So is boxing, Elena replied, most of the time. Commander Vex pulled up additional files, military training footage from various human armed forces throughout their history. These training exercises consistently involve actual injury rates. Your species appears incapable of separating preparation from implementation. Elena watched footage of human Marines conducting hand-to-hand combat drills, noting the intensity that her alien colleagues found so disturbing. You know what the real difference is? You all learned to make war theoretical before you went to the stars. We made it personal first. The observation created an uncomfortable silence. Most species had developed interstellar capabilities through cooperation, technological advancement, and the gradual elimination of large-scale conflict. Humanity had achieved the same result, while maintaining what appeared to be a permanent state of barely controlled aggression. The cadet, Zarek, 9 said eventually. Viper, 7. Is she representative? Elena considered this question with the sort of careful attention usually reserved for diplomatic negotiations. Define representative. Would an average human respond to training scenarios the same way? Probably not, Elena admitted. Most humans understand context better than she demonstrated. Commander Vex leaned back, clearly unsatisfied, but they would all be capable of the same response. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded slowly. Physical capability? Absolutely. Psychological inclination? That depends on circumstances. Dr. Moonweaver's crystalline structure flickered. Her species equivalent of nervous laughter. What circumstances would justify treating a training exercise as actual combat? The human professor seemed to consider several different answers before settling on the most diplomatically acceptable version, when the alternative is losing. Meanwhile, 3 levels down in the medical wing, Viper, 7 was discovering that alien medical technology possessed certain philosophical limitations. The Altarian healing pods could repair physical damage with remarkable efficiency, but they operated under the assumption that injuries were accidental rather than deliberately inflicted through superior technique. The scanners keep flagging my readings as inconsistent, she told the attending medic while examining the perfectly healed knuckles on her right hand. Something about elevated stress hormones and abnormal neural activity. The medic, a young hegemony intern whose previous experience involved treating beings who injured themselves through clumsiness rather than intentional violence, consulted his diagnostic equipment with growing confusion. Your biochemistry suggests you recently experienced a life-threatening situation, but the incident reports indicate this was a routine academy assessment. Viper, 7 flexed her fingers, testing the range of motion. Maybe your machines need recalibration. Perhaps. The intern agreed, though his tone suggested he found this explanation inadequate. The instructors you engaged, are they recovering adequately? Kelthane's getting his shoulder reconstructed, and the Venturian guy is still unconscious, she reported with the casual interest someone might show toward weather conditions. They'll be fine once they figure out how to treat combat injuries. instead of training accidents. The intern made a note in his medical file, though he suspected the distinction she was making was more significant than his education had prepared him to understand. "Will you be continuing with Academy coursework?" he asked. Viper 7 sat up, suddenly focused. "Assuming they don't kick me out for exceeding performance parameters. Yeah, this place has some interesting equipment I'd like to try." The intern finished his notes and authorized her discharge, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just released something dangerous into the Academy's general population. As she left the medical bay, he made a personal reminder to review the literature on human psychological profiles, assuming such literature existed and wasn't classified under some sort of diplomatic protection treaty. Back in the faculty lounge, the debate had evolved into something approaching crisis management. "We need to reassess the entire human integration program," Zarek 9 was saying. "If one cadet can disable 2 senior instructors using standard equipment, our assumptions about their species are fundamentally flawed." Elena stood up, gathered her datapad, and moved toward the exit. At the doorway, she paused. "You want some free advice?" she said. "Stop thinking of it as a human problem. Start thinking of it as a training problem. Your simulations work fine for species that learn cooperation first. For species that learn survival first, you might need different parameters." Intelligence Officer Krillnax had earned his position through 3 decades of methodical paranoia and an uncanny ability to detect patterns that others dismissed as coincidence. The Kepler Station incident had triggered every professional instinct he possessed, primarily because the official reports contained the sort of logical inconsistencies that usually preceded diplomatic disasters or systemic security failures. He sat alone in his cramped office, surrounded by holographic displays showing human military history spanning roughly 8,000 years of documented conflict. What disturbed him wasn't the violence. Most species had violent histories, but the consistent threat of treating preparation and execution as indistinguishable concepts. "Computer, cross-reference human recreational activities with documented military training protocols," he commanded, his synthesized voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to asking uncomfortable questions. The results materialized in 3-dimensional complexity. Human children played games involving capture, territorial control, and elimination of opponents. Their sports required protective equipment that other species reserve for actual combat. Their entertainment industries celebrated warriors with the same cultural reverence most civilizations accorded to philosophers or scientists. But the truly unsettling discovery emerged when he compared human martial arts with their military combat systems. The techniques were nearly identical, suggesting that civilian populations had been maintaining combat readiness as a form of cultural expression for millennia. Computer, analyze probability matrices. If human civilian training maintains military-grade combat effectiveness, what are the implications for their integration into interspecies institutions? The computational analysis produced results that Krillnax immediately classified under his personal security protocols. Every human civilian was, by galactic standards, a potential military asset with training equivalent to professional soldiers from more peaceful species. His research was interrupted by a priority communication from Admiral Orcs, the hegemony's regional military coordinator, a being whose career had been built on understanding threats before they materialized. Krillnax, the Admiral projection flickered to life. "I need your assessment of the human integration situation. Specifically, whether we're dealing with an isolated incident or a systematic underestimation of their species' capabilities." The intelligence officer activated his comprehensive data analysis. "Admiral, I've reviewed their historical documentation. The incident appears consistent with standard human behavioral parameters." "Explain." Krillnax manipulated his displays to show comparative data. "Human military doctrine has consistently emphasized adaptability over specialization. Their training methodologies prepare individuals to improvise weapons, tactics, and strategies using available resources rather than relying on standardized equipment. Admiral Korak studied the information with the focused attention of someone whose species had survived by recognizing existential threats early. You're suggesting they've maintained total warfare capabilities throughout their technological development. More precisely, they never developed non-warfare capabilities. Krill Nax corrected. Their educational systems, recreational activities, and cultural practices all maintain combat readiness as baseline functionality. The Admiral processes information through several long moments of silence. What are the strategic implications? Krill Nax have been dreading this question because the answer challenged fundamental assumptions about how civilized species behaved. If accurate, it means humanity achieved interstellar development while maintaining a population-wide military capability equivalent to our specialized combat forces. Population-wide, their historical record suggests that civilian populations regularly receive training in weapons use, tactical thinking, and survival skills as routine education. What we interpret as primitive violence was actually sophisticated preparation for asymmetric conflict scenarios. Admiral Korax leaned forward, his expression shifting from curiosity to genuine concern. Are you telling me that every human civilian is essentially a sleeper military unit? The question hung in the digital space between them, while Krill Nax consulted additional analysis protocols. Admiral, based on available data, I cannot definitively distinguish between human civilians and military personnel using standard classification metrics. The communication terminated abruptly, leaving Krill Nax alone with the implications of his research. He spent the next several hours reviewing Academy security protocols and discovering that they had been designed for species who maintain clear distinctions between combatants and non-combatants. Humans, apparently, had never developed such distinctions. His contemplation was interrupted by an alert from the Academy's monitoring systems. Another incident was developing in the Advanced Weapons Laboratory, where Viper 7 had been assigned to basic equipment familiarization exercises under close supervision. The security footage showed her examining a standard-issue plasma rifle with the sort of methodical attention that suggested she was reverse engineering its operational principles. The supervising instructor, a patient Centaurian who specialized in weapons safety, was explaining proper handling procedures when Viper 7 casually field-stripped the weapon and began reassembling it with modifications. Cadet, the instructor was saying, those components are not designed for field modification. Please return the weapon to standard configuration. Viper 7 looked up from her work with genuine confusion. You want me to use a rifle that's been deliberately handicapped? The firing mechanism is set for minimum efficiency. The targeting system has accuracy limiters, and the power cell is operating at roughly 60% capacity. Those are safety features, the instructor explained. Training weapons are designed to prevent accidental injury. Right, Viper 7 said, completing her modifications. But what if I need to hit something that's actually trying to kill me? The resulting weapon discharged with enough force to vaporize the laboratory's reinforced target array and punch a hole through two bulkheads before the automatic containment systems activated. Krill Nax watched the security footage 3 times before forwarding it to Admiral Korax with priority classification and a single-line comment. The problem is expanding. Within hours, similar reports began filtering in from other sections of the Academy. Human cadets were treating safety protocols as suggestions, converting training equipment into functional weapons, and approaching every educational exercise as if their survival depended on optimal performance. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Humans had integrated combat readiness so thoroughly into their basic psychology that they were incapable of recognizing artificial limitations on their effectiveness. Krillnax compiled his findings into a comprehensive report, though he suspected the conclusions would be dismissed as alarmist speculation by administrators who preferred problems that could be solved through policy adjustments rather than fundamental reconceptualization of an entire species. His final recommendation was simple: stop treating humans as typical military recruits and start treating them as weapons that happen to be capable of conversation. The report was classified immediately upon submission, though copies somehow found their way to every major intelligence agency in the sector, a phenomenon that Krillnax didn't investigate too closely, since he suspected the distribution was being handled by other humans who understood the strategic value of ensuring their capabilities were properly documented. Late that evening, as he reviewed the day's accumulated evidence, Krillnax realized that the most disturbing aspect of the situation wasn't human combat effectiveness or their inability to distinguish between training and warfare. It was a growing suspicion that they had known exactly how other species would react to discovering these characteristics, and had been carefully managing first contact protocols to avoid triggering premature defensive responses. 6 months after what Academy historians would diplomatically record as the Great Reassessment Period, Kepler Station had undergone changes that no amount of administrative doublespeak could disguise. The most obvious modification was architectural. Several corridors now featured reinforced bulkheads. Emergency medical stations had been relocated to high-traffic areas, and the weapons laboratory had been rebuilt with containment systems borrowed from Starship engineering departments. The less obvious changes were philosophical. Dean Althra, a dignified Cytherian whose previous challenges had involved scheduling conflicts and budget allocations, now found herself managing what amounted to a controlled military experiment disguised as higher education. She stood before the Academy Board of Governors, delivering a quarterly report that bore little resemblance to traditional academic documentation. Incidents involving human cadets have decreased by 78%, she announced, manipulating holographic charts that showed injury rates, property damage, and what the medical staff had begun categorizing as weaponization events. However, this reduction correlates directly with our revised training protocols rather than changes in human behavior. Governor Yex Prime, representing the Centaurian Educational Consortium, examined the data with visible bewilderment. You essentially redesigned the curriculum around a single species. We've adapted our methodology to accommodate beings who operate under different baseline assumptions about survival scenarios, Dean Althra corrected diplomatically. The results have been remarkably effective across all species demographics. This was true, though she didn't mention that non-human cadets had initially been traumatized by training exercises that assumed actual lethality as a starting point. The adjustment period had required extensive psychological counseling and several emergency medical interventions when students from peaceful civilizations encounter what humans considered basic preparedness drills. The breakthrough had come when the Academy stopped trying to teach humans to behave like other species, and instead began teaching other species to think like humans. Combat effectiveness across all cadets had improved dramatically once everyone understood that survival was always the primary objective, regardless of stated parameters. What about the human who initiated these changes? Asked Governor Chen, 7, whose crystalline form reflected nervous energy patterns. The Viper, 7 designation? Dean Althra suppressed what her species would have recognized as amusement. Instructor Viper, 7 has proven remarkably effective in her new role. The title change had been inevitable after the 3rd training incident involving human cadets who treated every exercise as potential combat, rather than continuing to pretend that humans could be trained to observe artificial limitations on their effectiveness. The Academy had promoted Viper 7 to senior combat instructor and tasked her with developing new training protocols. The results had been illuminating in ways that challenged everyone's preconceptions about the nature of violence itself. Her classes are consistently oversubscribed, Dean Althra continued. Cadets from 47 different species have requested transfer to her advanced combat programs. What she didn't mention was that Viper 7's teaching methodology had revealed something unexpected about interspecies military training. Most galactic civilizations had developed combat doctrine based on theoretical models rather than practical experience. When confronted with instruction from someone who treated every scenario as potentially lethal, students discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. The irony was considerable. Humans weren't teaching other species to be more violent. They were teaching them to be more effective by removing artificial constraints on their natural survival instincts. Are we creating a generation of warriors or soldiers? Governor Yex Prime asked, clearly struggling with concepts that his peaceful civilization had never needed to distinguish. Dean Althera considered the question carefully. Neither. We're creating graduates who understand that preparation and execution exist on a continuum rather than as separate categories. In her private office after the board meeting, Dean Althera reviewed the Academy's latest performance metrics. Graduation rates had improved. Employment placement in military and security positions had reached unprecedented levels. Most significantly, interspecies cooperation had increased as cadets learned to recognize and respect each other's survival capabilities rather than dismissing them as primitive or excessive. The transformation had been so successful that other military academies were requesting consultation on curriculum development. The Hegemony Defense Forces had established a permanent recruitment office on station. Even civilian institutions were inquiring about incorporating human-style preparedness training into their educational programs. The communication system chimed with an incoming priority message from Intelligence Officer Krillnax, whose reports had become essential reading for anyone trying to understand the broader implications of human integration. Dean Althera, his synthesized voice carried unusual urgency. I need to discuss my latest analysis of human behavioral patterns. The data suggests implications beyond military training applications. She authorized a connection, though she suspected she already knew what he was going to tell her. The humans, Krillnax began without preamble, have been operating under a completely different set of assumptions about galactic civilization from the beginning. Explain. They never believed we were peaceful, he said. Every aspect of their integration strategy has been designed around the assumption that other species were concealing their true combat capabilities for diplomatic reasons. The revelation recontextualized everything. Human behavior that had seemed aggressive or inappropriate suddenly made perfect sense if viewed through the lens of beings who assumed everyone else was also maintaining constant readiness for potential conflict. They thought we were all pretending, Dean Althera realized, like some sort of elaborate civilizational politeness. More precisely, they thought we were lying. Krillnax corrected. Their entire first contact protocol was built around the assumption that peaceful civilizations were either naive or deceptive, and they were trying to determine which category we fell into. The implications were staggering. Humanity had approached galactic integration as a military intelligence operation, carefully probing to determine actual threat levels, while presenting themselves as controllable primitives to avoid triggering defensive responses. So, when Viper 7 treated the training exercise as real combat, Dean Althera said slowly, she wasn't being aggressive, she was testing our capabilities. And when we demonstrated that our combat training was purely theoretical, they realized we were actually as peaceful as we claimed to be. Krillnax confirmed, which means they're now recalibrating their entire strategic assessment of galactic civilization. Dean Althera ended the communication and sat alone in her office, contemplating the elegant complexity of the situation. Humanity had infiltrated galactic society not through conquest or manipulation, but through the simple expedient of taking everyone at face value while maintaining their own species' survival protocols. They had been genuinely trying to fit in while remaining prepared for the possibility that fitting in was itself a form of warfare. 2 hours later, she found instructor Viper 7 in the Advanced Combat Laboratory, supervising a mixed species class practicing what the curriculum euphemistically called environmental adaptation exercises. The students were learning to convert common objects into defensive tools while maintaining situational awareness in what appear to be ordinary social settings. Instructor Dean Alpha recalled, "A moment, Viper 7 dismissed the class and approached with a casual alertness that had become her signature characteristic. Problem with the new protocols?" "Not exactly," Dean Alpha said. "I'm curious about something. When you first arrived at the academy, did you believe our training programs were designed to test your willingness to engage in actual combat?" Viper 7 considered the question with the sort of careful attention she usually reserved for tactical assessments. "Honestly, I figured you were either testing our resolve or genuinely didn't understand what real training looked like. And now I think you're probably the first truly peaceful civilization humanity has ever encountered," she said, "which is either going to be very good for everyone involved or very interesting." Dean Alpha found herself hoping those two possibilities weren't mutually exclusive.